Thank you, Master of Ceremony. First of all, I had to be a bit late because I had to ask the building management whether the capacity of this room is capable of holding so many heavyweight. And then after that, I went for a drink. After 2 beers, I don't remember what I was supposed to say. So luckily, with the help of Barry and his team, he anticipated my reckless way, so he has helped me to draft the opening remarks. Right? Hopefully it still makes sense even if I read it, because I'm now feeling a bit fuzzy, because we celebrate the presence of so many senior ladies and gentlemen, as well as my bosses in one way or another. Thank you all for being here. Yeah. As you know, the MC just said I'm Ong Keng Yong, Deputy Executive Chairman, or Executive Deputy Chairman. Okay, first mistake already. After 10 years, I still cannot get it right. Yeah. I'm what they call the EDC, Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS. The last time I checked, there were only 2 of us with this kind of title, Executive Deputy Chairman in corporate Singapore. Now the other guy has retired, so I'm the only one. I guess I can do anything I want. The other gentleman who was EDC, Barry, used to be Mr. Bruce Poe, Executive Deputy Chairman, ITE Education Services. But he just wrote to me to say, sorry, you have to go solo now, because he is retired fully and he's going to go to India to carry on the business of bringing business to Singapore via the ITE Education Services Private Limited. So okay, that means I can do anything I want, because I used to consult him what to say, what not to say. Now he's no longer around and he's no longer Executive Deputy Chairman of ITE business. So I want to congratulate Barry Desker for bringing so many of our friends, well-wishers and supporters to this little venue. I think the last time I checked, no one had been able to command such a big crowd of influential past and present personality to this small hall that we have. So that whenever I come, I have to support the bar counter, otherwise they have no business. I think this week his business is done, because we just finished quite a few rounds. We are thankful for Barry's continued presence in RSIS, and I feel that this particular book is particularly noteworthy because it encapsulates his contribution to the school, as well as the School of International Studies, the University, NTU, Singapore, especially with regard to his diplomatic service. Barry has an illustrious career. After his formal retirement from RSIS, the school that we are all in now, that was in 2014, he continued to serve the public and policy circles. Actually, he's still a member of the Presidential Council for Minority Rights and a member of the Board of Directors of the Lee Kuan Yew Exchange Fellowship. Before he joined us at RSIS in the year 2000, he was CEO of the then Singapore Trade Development Board. Currently, I don't know, under his reincarnation and whatever, the different names, I lost track already. So it's called what, Enterprise Singapore? Or is it Future Enterprise? I'm not sure. But he had been instrumental in bringing up the school, developed RSIS into what it is today. So we are very thankful to his effort and his contribution to the school. Many of you know him as someone who has served in the Singapore Diplomatic Service. He was our famous ambassador to Indonesia for many years, and then after that, while he continued to work in RSIS, he was also our ambassador of many years, standing to Spain as well as the Vatican City. I have known Barry since I joined the Foreign Ministry, and I do not know whether Barry, remember, I was one of the desk officers working for him. Yeah, and at that time, one of the things I had to do is to cover Saudi Arabia and Israel. And at one point, I think he thought that I was very pro-Israel. So he said, don't let him go to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, he will get into trouble with the Saudi authority. I don't know whether the Saudi diplomats are here today. But anyway, I went there and spent 4 years in Saudi Arabia under his guidance in headquarters. So, over the years, we benefited from one very important character, the gentleman called S.R. Nathan, who later became the 6th President of the Republic of Singapore. He used to be angry with all of us for not doing whatever he wanted us to do. Yeah, but Barry was lucky because he was the boss. We, below Barry, will always get scolded by him, Mr. Nathan. Yeah, but anyway, we learned a lot from our time with the late Mr. Nathan, and I think it's very important for us to remember a lesson learned under his tutelage, and I'm happy to say that in part of the book, Barry has written about some of the early days of experiences with the late S.R. Nathan and our time at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, he was my boss at that time, so whatever he say is the last word, yeah? Whatever I say will not count for now. Reflection, Singapore's place in the world, is his latest production. It's a rather thick book. Frankly, I did not know many of the things that he wrote about until I revisited many of the chapters since he handed me the copy of the book. So it's actually quite a reflective book and also very, in my opinion, strategic, because many of the things that he had talked about, he wrote about, had come to fruition and help to improve Singapore's foreign policy as well as the work of RSIS as he had retired from foreign service and went into academia. So, to cut a long story short, he spent many years in RSIS, and until today he is still in RSIS as our distinguished fellow, and most recently, 2 or 3 years back, he became professor of practice at the NTU. So I think this is the first professor of practice NTU appointed, right? Yeah. Third one, first from RSIS lah. Okay, that counts also lah. I don't know what goes on between Barry and my dean of the school of College of Humanity, Arts and Social Sciences, Joseph Liow. He used to be our dean at the RSIS, so they got their way of getting things done. Given the longevity of Barry's career, we have much to learn from his wide-ranging experiences. The book Reflection brings together his long-term observation of trends stemming from his time in Indonesia, whereby he reflects on Islam's conservative shift in Indonesia to what we see today under the newly installed President Prabowo. His analysis remains a vital guiding point for all of us covering Indonesia and its development going forward. What is important also is that Barry has extensive experience in international trade and international trade agreements, and over the years he has helped to contribute to many of those things that we are familiar with today, trade agreements, regional partnership on economic or trade relations, and so on and so forth. So we are extremely fortunate to be beneficiary of Barry's keen observation as articulated in his book, latest book, Reflections. maybe I should say a bit more about what he had written. Parts of Reflections attest to Barry's far-sighted approach to honing RSIS niche among think tanks. One of these is a section on energy security and climate change. This represents a broadening of the RSIS agenda and our interest as a school for international studies, because we go into energy security and related issues which go beyond the traditional coverage by RSIS. The other chapter of note is on religion and terrorism, notably the rise of the Al-Qaeda and the awareness of Jamaah Islamiyah JI activities in Southeast Asia. I see quite a few of our experts on JI and Islamic activism or Islamist activism in our region here among the audience. So thank you for your effort. These commentaries help to serve to increase our awareness of the challenges facing this little red dot called Singapore. But it also helped to guide RSIS's rapid response to challenges facing the region and place RSIS at the cutting edge of policy-oriented research on terrorism and political violence in Southeast Asia. All these writings reflect Barry's nimble ability to pivot his enduring interest in policy research with what is expected of RSIS. Barry's long-standing interest in Singapore-Indonesia relations also allow us a glimpse into the workings of the upper echelon of Indonesian politics. We have here Bapak Purnomo, who used to be a minister in the previous cabinet in Indonesia, and the last time I saw him was when he was Minister of Energy in Indonesia. So, Bapak, thank you for coming and be part of this book launch. Barry's commentaries provide a rare glimpse into the personal relationship between Lee Kuan Yew, then Prime Minister, and President Suharto. These two gentlemen were instrumental in setting the tone for the positive bilateral relationship between Indonesia and Singapore and brought us to where we are today. So we can see the trust between the two senior leaders, and that the trust between them has enabled our bilateral relationship to survive the bumps and other kind of challenges we get from time to time in this clouded region called Southeast Asia. Through his commentaries on ASEAN, the Southeast Asian challenges, especially the South China Sea issue, and the rise of Asia, and the call for the suspension of Myanmar membership in ASEAN, Barry has demonstrated his unflinching ability to critique what he sees as shortcomings of international and regional institutions. For instance, in the case of ASEAN, Barry has been critical of its shortcomings in economic integration and ability to handle economic political crisis, even as he argued for the continued commitment of Singapore towards ASEAN. His dedication to telling hard truths, even as he reaffirmed his support for multilateralism and regionalism, is not one to be taken lightly. This is especially so, as you can see now, we are in the midst of an increasingly polarized international environment. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, I would like to conclude by congratulating Barry Desker on his book. We have congratulated him many times, but once again, formally in front of all your supporters and admirers, or what we call Papat Perry's constituency, we had to reaffirm that we admire your work and your foresight, yeah, and your contribution to the school as well as to NTU. I hope you will get these kind of feelings as you read his book. I am not here to just say things to promote him without a basis. He has many chapters in the book that confirm all that I have just said in the past 10 minutes or so. Many nuggets of wisdoms he has passed on to us will continue to guide us going forward, especially in a very complicated regional and international environment. Okay, I think enough of listening to me. I think I should now just invite all of you to join me in a great round of applause for Barry Desker. We are glad as RSIS to be part of this celebration of your distinguished career, Barry. And I'm also very happy that my RSIS colleague can see for themselves that the man is actually for real. We always talk about his great work, great writing, but for now, all of them can see all the famous greats of Singapore civil service, Singapore business sector, Singapore's regional friends here in this room. Thank you all for coming, and now we shall listen to other complimentary remarks about Barry, or Barry himself had to tell us why he's still so fascinating to all of us after so many years. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, after so many beer, I don't know what I'm doing.
Okay. Thank you, Keng Yong. I am not an ubat seller, so I don't have Keng Yong's remarkable gift of turning a simple point into a story which all of you will listen to. Friends and colleagues, I'm honored to have you here present today. Instead of the usual Singapore practice of having a VIP launch the book, inviting a number of ministers and permanent secretaries, and then having behind the book ceremony placed so that we will officially launch it, I decided to do things a bit differently. I said that I wanted to have my friends and colleagues present here, and that is what I have today. So I'm very pleased that you could join me today, and I'm grateful that you could attend this afternoon, despite the many pressing commitments that you have. I'm also pleased that my good friends, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Professor Joseph Liow, and Sir Steve Smith have agreed to share the podium with me. Keng Yong succeeded me at RSIS and has now steered the ship for more than a decade. As a former Secretary General of ASEAN, he brought a strong commitment to ASEAN and has helped to shape RSIS to meet the challenges of a different regional and international environment. Joseph Liow served as the Deputy Dean of RSIS during the latter part of my term of office there. He is a product of the RSIS training scheme, which has led to a new generation of younger Singapore scholars who can stand shoulder to shoulder with our colleagues recruited internationally. Joseph is probably the most outstanding of that batch and has in fact just taken over as well as the chairman of the Middle East Institute at NUS, beside all his appointments at RSIS. Steve Smith was a guiding light when I moved to academia. He served as RSIS's external examiner, before becoming our longest-serving board member. It is a measure of his abilities that Steve was appointed by the Minister of Education as part of the international team which undertook the review of university standards in Singapore. And he is also now on the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I was honored to be conferred an honorary doctorate by the University of Exeter in 2013 when Steve was the Vice Chancellor of the university. I must admit that I initially set out to write a memoir, but decided that it was unlikely that I would have much to say that would be of interest to a larger audience. However, since I had moved to NTU as the director of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies in 2000, I had written a series of commentaries, writing at least 5 or 6 a year, especially from the perspective of Singapore's interests in these developments. I felt that some of these op-eds were still relevant today. Putting a selection together would give you as readers an opportunity to discern the development of my own thinking on these issues. For good measure, I also added some articles which provided personal insights and would have formed part of my memoirs had I proceeded along that route. These articles include my personal experiences working with President S.R. Nathan in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and traveling with Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, when the RSIS IDSS commentary series was inaugurated in 2001, there were few op-ed articles written by Singapore-based analysts. International observers hogged the limelight in the Straits Times and Business Times. There was rarely a case where you had local views being put forth in the newspapers which we read each day. I would like to thank Singapore Press Holdings for responding positively to my suggestion in 2002 that IDSS commentaries could be carried by the SPH newspapers, while our staff would be encouraged to write for the media. This was necessary because what they needed to do was to write in a clear and cogent fashion for a larger audience beyond academia. It wasn't what the 6 closest people to you thought of your paper that was important, but what the mass of readers felt when they read through your article. As Straits Times articles were often reprinted in regional newspapers, this expanded the readership of our commentary series. From its inception in 2007, RSIS had the dual functions of a professional school of international affairs and a policy-oriented think tank, which was focused on developing, and here I quote Dr. Tony Tan, comprehensive approaches to strategic thinking related to Singapore's interests. Tony Tan was then Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defense, and he made these remarks at the launch of IDSS in 1996. Our thinking was that as less than 5% of each year's MSc cohort went on to academia and to complete PhD degrees, it was critical that RSIS taught its students how to reach out to a wider audience and nurture their abilities so that they could compete in various fields. While developing a cutting-edge master's program for about 200 students annually, RSIS also included non-examination modules involving the handling of TV interviews, which was done at Channel News Asia, the writing of policy papers, scenario planning exercises, and even war games periodically. By writing op-eds, my colleagues demonstrated that we were walking the talk. We wrote cogently for a wider audience, even as we published in major academic journals. The writing of op-eds also gelled with RSIS's other function of serving as a policy-oriented think tank. Reading the book, you will see that the subjects I covered reflected areas in which RSIS was building a capacity. I brought an expertise on Indonesia and ASEAN to RSIS, having served for more than 11 years in Jakarta after intensive graduate studies at SOAS and Cornell, 3 years in New York, and more than 10 years handling Southeast Asian affairs at MFA. I was, I think, the first Singapore ambassador to Indonesia who focused on both political and economic issues. Like other diplomats, I observed and reported on political developments in Indonesia. What made the appointment interesting was that I broke new ground in working with EDB. And here I thank Philip Yeo and his team at EDB, because what we did was promoted pioneering projects like the Batam Industrial Park, the Bintan Beach Tourist Resort, and the Liow Water Agreement. What I did was brought the projects to EDB together with a possible business partner, and I must admit, I was gratified that EDB responded very quickly and positively to this initiative. I also worked with the business communities in Indonesia and Singapore, promoting partnerships and joint ventures. Before this was a standard operational tool for Singapore agencies working abroad. Here I have a couple of my friends who today who had been part of that process with me in Jakarta. Pak Purnomo, who was Minister of Energy and later Minister of Defense, and now has come back as Special Envoy for Energy Issues with ministerial rank, is here today. My good friend T.K. Liow, whom I first knew when he was driving a Corolla, and now he never is seen without a Rolls Royce and flying his own jet. And Yusuf Wanandi, who was a friend with me when I first watched the Indonesian elections way back in 1971, and he was playing political games, helping Golkar to win the election. So I'm pleased to have you here today. In 1994, after Jakarta, I moved to the Trade Development Board. Some of my close colleagues from TDB are here today, including David Chin, Tam Hock Chi, Seok Lee, and others from TDB. Looking back, the most personally satisfying contribution was the development of a core of trade policy experts with expertise on ASEAN and WTO issues. When I stepped down in 2000, day-to-day handling of trade policy returned to MTI, together with the team which had been built up by TDB. This team was responsible for the network of free trade agreements that you now see that Singapore has concluded. So we built a capacity which MTI did not have at that time. When I moved to RSIS, these concerns and interests pushed me in the direction of strengthening RSIS's regional and global footprint. RSIS initiated and hosted the network of ASEAN Defense and Security Institutions, NADI. And I think my good friend Kwa Chong Kwan will confirm that we are still the host of NADI. We also participate actively in the Council of Councils, composed of 25 leading global institutes of international affairs, as well as in Think 20, which is the think tank counterpart of the G20. When I moved to RSIS, I quickly moved beyond the realm of an international trade negotiator, Southeast Asia geopolitics specialist, and Indonesia watcher to cover a broader range of issues. I spoke and wrote frequently on terrorism and political violence, as well as climate change, the environment, and energy security than I ever envisaged before I took this appointment. Friends, RSIS has been a comfortable home for the past 24 years to think about issues, engage with the younger generation of scholars and policymakers, and to learn from the constant stream of international visitors. This book represents the wide-ranging exchanges that I've had over the years. As the book is geared to a wider audience, I avoided footnotes. Each article can be read on its own. I tried to reach out to the non-specialists by avoiding the use of technical language. When this could not be avoided, I have explained these ideas with a view to clarifying issues, such as my discussions of the Abangan Santri division in Indonesia, the shift from global trade negotiations at the WTO to plurilateral trade negotiations at the regional level, and the emergence of non-traditional security issues as a major foreign policy focus. During the years I have been at RSIS, I have been engaged in frequent overseas travel, late-night discussions with a range of visiting policymakers and scholars, and participation in conferences often organized over weekends so that overseas participants could attend. My wife and family have been and have had to bear the burden of a lifestyle which they thought I had forsaken when I moved out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Trade Development Board. I appreciate their forbearance and their willingness to bear with me. Without Peggy's organizational skills, investment savvy, and ability to plan effectively, I would not have had the space to think and write on the issues discussed in this book. Finally, for those who are curious, my 10-year-old granddaughter, Anya, selected the book cover from 18 prepared by the publisher's designer. She told me that she is now thinking of writing a book of her own. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lester. May I now invite Professor Joseph Liow to share his comments of reflections, Singapore's place in the world. Professor Liow, please.
A very good afternoon to you all. When Barry called me to ask if I could say a few words at this book launch, I didn't hesitate at all to agree. By the way, it's not because my ex-boss called me, and so I had no choice. I had to come. Yeah, it's a delight to be here. A great pleasure for me to be here today. Let me start my remarks with some reflections on the book, which is a collection of thought pieces, as we have heard, that Barry penned through his term as director of IDSS, the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, and then dean of RSIS. You look through these essays in this collection, and two things strike you immediately. First, you can tell very quickly that Barry is someone who spent a lot of time and energy pondering the challenges that beset our world, how they have evolved over time, and how we as a society and a country can overcome them. Second, every essay contains vignettes of insight and kernels of wisdom that only come with decades of intimate involvement in the worlds of international diplomacy and global commerce. Having spent a significant amount of time in the world of international trade and economics before he came to RSIS, it is no surprise that a considerable number of pieces are on the topic of trade and of multilateralism. Through these essays, Barry lent an important, balanced, and sober voice to debates about the relevance and shortcomings of the WTO, of ASEAN, and other similar institutions. Sadly, those debates and those issues that Barry highlighted are still with us today and remain unresolved. In fact, the fact may well be that multilateralism is even gloomier today in terms of its prospects. And Barry was not someone who shied away from expressing views that went against the grain. In 2007, he argued robustly that ASEAN should consider suspending Myanmar. In 2009, he stated openly that then Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's Asia-Pacific community was, quote, dead in the water, unquote. Looking at what is happening in Myanmar and the Asia-Pacific today, the word prescient comes to mind. One thing I enjoyed very much about many of Barry's essays are the pithy yet sound historical perspectives he lent to any topic he writes on. This comes across clearly in practically every piece in the collection. When talking about the possibility that Indonesia might outgrow ASEAN, for instance, he engages the legacies of Sukarno and Suharto, the two towering figures that set things in motion for Indonesian foreign policy. Likewise, his essays on extremism and terrorism post 9/11 and post Bali bombing demonstrate a keen understanding of the historical antecedents of such movements in Southeast Asia and the ideas that underpin them. My favorite section of the book is probably section 8, where Barry engages in some crystal ball gazing to discern longer-term trends. In the first essay of section 8, titled As Asia Rises, New Challenges Emerge, Barry writes, and I quote, "A major weakness in many analyses of global trends is the tendency to assume that developments in societies we are familiar with will be replicated elsewhere. We tend to be optimistic and focus on the good news in reaching conclusions about the fate of other societies. Living in Singapore, we get caught up in the hype on the rise of Asia and the shift in power from west to east. What is forgotten is that Asia's rise has occurred in an era of peace and relative political stability," unquote. This essay was written in 2013. 11 years may have passed since, but as Asia deals with a host of challenges that threatens its peace and prosperity today, Barry's cautionary subtext is nothing if not spot on. Another snippet that resonates profoundly today comes from an essay titled Singapore's Place in the World. In fact, for me, this essay is a contender for the best piece in the entire collection. In this piece, Barry ruminates. For countries like Singapore, which is at the technological cutting edge and whose population is almost universally connected through the internet and mobile phone, it will be increasingly difficult for mass media, long-established religious institutions, and universities to exert their traditional influence. Likewise, governments will find that individuals and private groups with shared interests will gain more autonomy and will pay less heed to the concerns of the state. Although Western observers assume that this transformation will have a democratizing effect, it could also lead to greater intolerance and a closing of minds as people only read and hear views that they agree with, unquote. In the so-called woke age of today, these words and warnings could not ring any truer. Now please allow me to share some personal reflections about the man behind these thoughtful and well-crafted essays. I had the privilege to work for and with Barry for the entire duration of his time at RSIS. A significant portion of it was as his his associate dean. Those years proved to be an immensely enriching experience for me. He was someone who is interested in the views and perspectives of his team, especially when they differed from his own, and he would listen to them intently and take them seriously. When he took the helm, Barry inherited an institution that was still trying to find its footing. The late S.R. Nathan, Barry's ex-boss from their MFA's days, started IDSS back in 1996 with a clear idea of what he wanted it to become. But within a couple of years, as we know, he was called to higher office. Professor Kong Yun Fong steadied the institution for the year that he ran it and sowed the seeds of academic curiosity among a young group of graduate students, many of them Singaporeans, who were associated with IDSS in those early days. But it was left to Barry to bring IDSS to the next level, and he did this with great success. He oversaw an expansion of topics and areas of coverage, judiciously developed in-house expertise and allowed them to flourish, and also diversified funding sources and built up the resources of the school. He later initiated the transformation of IDSS into RSIS, the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and focused his energies on building an identity for the school that was based on a solid foundation, not just of policy relevance, but indeed of sound academic research and output. He also led by example. While the book being launched today is a compilation of his think pieces, some of you might not know that Barry is also the sole author of several double-blind, peer-reviewed international journal articles, that bane of all university tenure-track faculty. Furthermore, he not only delivered opening and keynote remarks at high-profile conferences, but also sat alongside assistant professors on academic panels at the International Studies Association to present academic papers complete with footnotes and bibliographies. Indeed, it was his unique ability to strike that all-important balance between academic scholarship and policy relevance that made RSIS the well-known and respected institution it is today. This is a legacy that the current team, helmed by Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, continues to build on. Finally, all of us know that Barry is at heart a family man. So it is wonderful to see the family here. But it would be remiss of me not to mention the strong, steady presence who has been standing alongside Barry all this time. And that is his wife, Peggy, but I always call her Mrs. Desker. I think my ex-boss will agree with me that the accolades belong as much to her as they do to him. So, let me end by congratulating Barry again, and Peggy, Mrs. Desker, for the publication of this important book and for your unstinting contributions in making RSIS and Singapore an intellectual hub for the study of international affairs and practice of global diplomacy.
Thank you, Professor Liow. We now invite Professor Sir Steve Smith to share his comments of reflections, Singapore's place in the world. Sir Steve, please.
Thank you. Well, it's genuinely a great honour and a great pleasure to be able to say a few words on this occasion. I've known Barry since the year 2000, when he took over as the head of IDSS, and that's nearly 25 years. For the first few years, I was a participant in the annual APSMO held in Singapore each August, then external examiner, and then I became a member of the board of RSIS from 2007 until this year. During that time, I saw first IDSS, then RSIS, grow into becoming the leading security think tank in the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, many people made that possible, including so many of you here today. But I have absolutely no reservation in saying that Barry was the driving force behind making RSIS so successful. And successful in two very distinct and often mutually conflicting settings. First, as a leading think tank, and secondly, as a centre in one of the world's leading universities. Having served as a member of the Singapore Ministry of Education's Kwafu process from 2014 to 2024, which looked in detail at how Singapore's universities are performing, I can absolutely assure you that being a research and teaching unit in NTU, as well as a think tank, is a very difficult balance to achieve. But under Barry's wise and crucially very active leadership, RSIS achieved exactly this. I saw firsthand how Barry worked so hard to get the right balance between appointing and retaining first-rate academics who would publish in the very best journals and collections in the world, and also nurture these same colleagues to contribute to the public realm, writing op-eds and discussion papers for the policy community here in Singapore and beyond. I know how actively he had to manage that, and also I know how some factions in RSIS thought that their role was to be either an academic or a policy commentator, but certainly not both. It's a profound tribute to his leadership, along with key colleagues, again, many of whom are in the room, that he managed this balancing act with a combination of deft diplomatic skills and an unwavering commitment that RSIS would indeed perform both missions. Barry's success was to get the balance just right. And every year I looked at the annual publication report and was genuinely pleased to see such a rich combination of leading academic and powerful policy contributions. It took rare skills to achieve this, and Barry had them in spades. But today, we're here to celebrate the publication of Reflections, Singapore's Place in the World, a collection of some 61 papers, mostly originally published as op-ed articles in the Straits Times. In addition, there are 3 introductory sections, a preface outlining the contents of the book, a reflection on the origins of the individual papers set against the history of IDSS, RSIS, and then a very warm chapter looking at S.R. Nathan's time at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'd seen several of these papers when they were published as the RSIS commentary series, but what's so useful about this collection is that the papers are organised thematically into 8 sections. I spent the last weekend reading the book, and what comes through so clearly are 2 things. First, the sheer range of issues that Barry covers, and secondly, the wisdom and subtlety of his arguments. The papers span some 25 years, but in contrast with so many contributions to policy debates, they've aged incredibly well. In this sense, the book is much more than a series of individual discussions. It is a seasoned and reflective diplomat's analysis of a period of considerable change, but always through a lens that remains consistent in both its theoretical underpinnings and, crucially, its values. Barry's commitment to ASEAN and his nuanced assessment of how to deal with China come through time after time. And the focus on Singapore's role in the foreign, economic and security landscape of the region is consistent and always incredibly thoughtful. I learnt a lot reading the book, and I must confess, compared to my European perspective on the rise of China, Barry makes a compelling case for the need to balance Singapore's response to that rise with its relationship with the USA. I was particularly taken by his comments in chapter 8.4, written in July 2013, and I quote a paragraph from it. While few would question that Asian powers are once again exerting an important influence on the global stage, those of us who live in the region should be wary of triumphalist voices with a very short-term memory. Not only will there be resistance by the West to a power transition as Asian states increase their political, economic, and military capacity, but weaker Asian states will also be more wary about the growing power and influence of the emerging regional hegemon. China's neighbors will be pulled in two directions, increasingly oriented towards China economically, but moving closer to the US and to one another as security partners, end quote. Similarly, like others, I was fascinated about the tensions within ASEAN posed by events in Myanmar in both 2007 and since 2021. And again, Barry writes with a convincing sensitivity to the complexities that events in Myanmar poses for the other members of ASEAN. In other sections of the book, Barry deals with global trade, with energy and climate change, with religion and terrorism, with intra-ASEAN relations, with Singapore-Indonesian relations and Indonesian domestic politics, with ASEAN's global engagement, and with East meets West in the 21st century. Time and again, his insights and wisdom shone through, and I came away from reading the book with a renewed respect for the quality of his analysis and ultimately his values. But I have to confess that some of the sections of the book that I enjoyed the most were those dealing with the personalities that he's worked with. His essay on S.R. Nathan's time at the MFA is really eye-opening for those of us who had the privilege to meet Mr. Nathan at IDSS, RSIS, and then when he was president of Singapore. To me, he was always such a kind and gentle man, avuncular almost. But what comes through from Barry's description of working with him is a man who was a hard taskmaster, both in how papers should be written, 2 pages maximum, cut out all the palaver, as Mr. Nathan put it, and in the high standards he required of his staff, arguing, quote, "You must be seized with the issues," quote, instituting morning prayers at 10 a.m. so that all the team could be briefed. But, as Barry notes, Mr. Nathan made fundamental changes to the way the MFA worked so that its best staff had a chance to stay working at the centre rather than be posted abroad. Barry's chapter is incredibly persuasive in its discussion of the contributions that Mr. Nathan made to Singapore's foreign policy. It concludes by quoting from a very warm note that Mr. Nathan wrote to Barry after their last meeting in July 2016, incredibly appropriately enough, at a lunch to celebrate 20 years of IDSS. Now, as someone who's been to Singapore around 75 times in the last 25 years, the chapters discussing Lee Kuan Yew's prime ministership are fascinating for the glimpses of what it must have been like to work for him. I liked particularly the story about the turmoil Barry went through when President Suharto organised a very lavish lunch for the Singapore delegation to Bali in 1975, whereas Lee Kuan Yew had insisted on a very sparse small meal. The day was saved by the Prime Minister's doctor, who said to Lee Kuan Yew, "You are having hospital food, we are eating normal food." It was also reassuring to see that Lee Kuan Yew was entirely wrong about Barry and Peggy's purchase of a house, costing $1 million in 1989. Lee Kuan Yew said to Barry, $1 million? You must be mad. Barry points out that it was the best investment he and Peggy had ever made, though those of us who know them well surely think that their marriage was the very best investment that either of them made. Finally, I was very struck by the description Barry gives of the day in 1965, August the 9th, when Singapore's independence from Malaysia was announced. Barry conveys the sense of trepidation that so many felt that day, and he builds on that to discuss Singapore's sense of community, which he sees as central to the country prospering in the years after separation, but which he now worries about because he sees it as being threatened by growing inequality. It is actually an outstandingly thoughtful chapter of the book. Of course, I've only been able to mention a few of the themes that Barry discusses in the book, and I certainly have not been able to do justice to the richness of his analysis or the breadth of subjects he discusses in these 64 sections. It really is a fascinating book, and I'm honestly so glad to have had the chance to see a proof copy in advance of publication. So, today we're here to celebrate Barry's incredible contribution to our understanding of Singapore's foreign and defence policies, to celebrate his fantastic contributions to Singapore's external relations, and to celebrate his contribution to building the leading academically outstanding policy-relevant defence and security think tank in the Asia-Pacific region. But in celebrating Barry's achievements, like Joe, it would be entirely remiss of me not to mention the role that Peggy has played in all of this. So it really is an honour to stand here to celebrate Barry's work, but to do so within the context of his and Peggy's marriage. From those early days when they met outside the old post office, now the Fullerton Hotel, to the loving family that they've nurtured and are here today. Thank you all for listening. And Barry, what an achievement this book records, not just about Singapore, but of your massive contribution to both its external policies and, as this book shows, to the public debate that is essential for our understanding of these crucial issues. Thank you.